November 1941. American soldier John Stensby arrives in the Philippines. 1 month later, the Japanese capture him, and hell begins. The Death March. 65 miles with no water, no food. Fall down, they bayonet you on the spot. 10,000 corpses left rotting on the road. The Hell Ship. 1,000 men sealed in a cargo hold. 120 degrees. Total darkness. Men die standing up. There's nowhere to fall. The Coal Mine. 1 mile underground. 12 hours in pitch-black darkness, knee-deep in freezing water. Japanese guards beat you, bite you, throw rocks at you. Every single day, the tunnel could collapse and bury you alive. 40% of Americans died in Japanese captivity, 20 times more than in German camps. But Stensby survived. He had a secret, something the Japanese never discovered. A way to keep fighting, even in chains. You're about to learn how one American soldier went through every circle of hell and won. Every word is documented fact. Brace yourself. This is going to be brutal. November 1941. The USS Hugh L. Scott cuts through the Pacific waters, carrying Chief Warrant Officer John L. Stensby toward an appointment with destiny. The 21-year-old artilleryman stands at the rail, watching the endless blue horizon. In his pocket, a menu from tonight's dinner aboard the transport ship. Turkey with all the trimmings. Pumpkin pie. The last American meal he will taste for nearly 4 years. He does not know that in 31 days, the world will explode. He does not know that he is sailing toward a living death, toward a nightmare that will consume him and tens of thousands of others. He does not know that the gentle rocking of this ship will be replaced by the violent shaking of hell ships, that his healthy frame will be reduced to a walking skeleton, that he will descend into mines so deep and dark they seem to bore directly into the Earth's core. The USS Hugh L. Scott arrives in the Philippines in mid-November 1941. Stensby is assigned to the 60th Coast Artillery Regiment. Manila is beautiful, exotic, warm. The American soldiers joke about their easy posting. Some believe they will never see combat. They are spectacularly, terrifyingly wrong. December 7, 1941, 07:55. Pearl Harbor burns. 8 hours later, the Japanese bombers appear over the Philippines, destroying most of MacArthur's air force on the ground. The invasion begins immediately. Within weeks, Manila falls. American and Filipino forces retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, and John Stensby's war truly begins. January 7, 1942. The Battle of Bataan begins. Stensby mans his artillery position as Japanese forces press relentlessly against the American-Filipino defensive lines. The soldiers go on half rations immediately. By February, they are eating quarter rations. A soldier in intensive combat requires 3,500 calories per day. By March, Stensby and his comrades are receiving 1,000 calories daily. The hunger is unlike anything he has experienced. It gnaws at him constantly, a living thing inside his belly. Men begin to lose weight rapidly. 20 pounds, 30 pounds. Some lose nearly a third of their body weight. They become hollow-eyed, gaunt. Disease spreads through the ranks. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi. The jungle itself seems to be attacking them. "We're holding," Stensby tells himself daily, manning his artillery piece. But deep down, he knows the truth. There will be no reinforcements, no supply ships, no rescue. They are alone, abandoned, slowly dying on this green peninsula that has become their prison. By April, the men can barely lift their weapons. They stumble through their duties, skeletal figures in tattered uniforms. The Japanese forces are fresh, well-fed, numerous. The outcome is inevitable. April 3rd, 1942. The Japanese launched their final assault. For 6 days, Stensby and the defenders fight with everything they have left. But they have nothing left. Their bodies are failing, their ammunition is nearly exhausted. Their hope died weeks ago. April 9th, 1942, 06:15. Major General Edward P. King makes the decision to surrender Bataan. He defies MacArthur's orders and accepts personal responsibility. Stensby is out on patrol when the surrender order comes. He refuses to accept it. For 1 more month, John Stensby fights. He eludes Japanese forces, living in the jungle, still resisting, still believing that somehow this nightmare will end differently. He is not captured on April 9th with the others. He holds out. He fights on, alone, desperate, defiant. But by May 1942, even Stensby's resistance crumbles. He is finally captured. The moment he raises his hands in surrender, he ceases to be a soldier in his captor's eyes. Under the Japanese military code of Bushido, surrender is the ultimate shame. A man who surrenders is less than human, deserving of nothing but contempt and brutality. John Stensby has just become, in Japanese eyes, a non-person, and he will be treated accordingly for the next 3.5 years. Stensby enters captivity already weakened, but the worst is yet to come. While he missed the original Bataan Death March in April, he will experience the same brutal system that killed thousands of his comrades. Those who surrendered on April 9th were gathered at the southern tip of Bataan at Mariveles and Bagak. 78,000 men, 12,000 Americans, 66,000 Filipinos. Already starving, already diseased, already dying. They were organized into groups of 100 men, with 4 Japanese guards per group. They were ordered to turn over all possessions. American Lieutenant Kermit Lay described what happened. They pulled us off into a rice paddy and began shaking us down. There were about 100 of us, so it took time to get to all of us. Everyone had pulled their pockets wrong side out and laid all their things out in front.
They were taking jewelry and doing a lot of slapping.
Then the guards took an officer and 2 enlisted men behind a rice shack and shot them. The crime? Possessing Japanese souvenirs. Word spread quickly through the prisoners. Anything Japanese must be destroyed, hidden, because possession of it meant immediate execution. The march began on April 10th, 65 miles to the railhead at San Fernando, then another journey to Camp O'Donnell. In blistering heat, the prisoners stumbled forward. No food, no water, no rest. The guards beat them with rifle butts, sabers, clubs, anything available. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Men who asked for water were beaten. Men who stopped to help a fallen comrade were shot. The sun beat down mercilessly. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. The men's feet blistered and bled. Their tongues swelled. Their lips cracked. Thirst became a madness. Some men broke ranks to drink from filthy puddles. The guards beat them and left them to die.
They beat us with rifle butts, sabers, clubs, anything they could get their hands on,
survivor James Bolich later recounted. That went on all day long. They wouldn't let anybody have a drink of water or let us rest, and they didn't feed us. American soldier Bert Bank recalled seeing a prisoner with a ring. The Japanese guard wanted it. The man couldn't remove it. His fingers were too swollen. The guard cut off his finger to get the ring. The march took 5 to 10 days depending on where each group joined it. Along the way, approximately 10,000 men died. 1,000 Americans, 9,000 Filipinos. Beaten to death, shot, bayoneted, beheaded, died of heat stroke, died of thirst, died of disease. Their bodies littered the route, bloating in the tropical sun. Survivor accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Men so weak they could not stand were kicked until they rose or died. Men with dysentery soiling themselves as they walked, because stopping meant death.
Men watching their friends executed for the crime of being too weak to continue. The guards seemed to take pleasure in the cruelty. Some bayoneted prisoners randomly. Some beheaded men for entertainment. Some knocked out prisoners' teeth to steal gold fillings. At San Fernando, the survivors were crammed into steel-sided boxcars, 100 men to a car designed for 40. The heat inside was unbearable. Men passed out. Some died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies. The cars had no ventilation, no toilets, no water. The journey took hours. When the doors finally opened, some men tumbled out, already dead. From the second railhead, the prisoners marched another 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Of the 78,000 who began the journey, only 54,000 reached the camp alive. Camp O'Donnell was designed to hold 10,000 men. The Japanese crammed 60,000 into it. The camp had been a Philippine Army training facility. Now it became a charnel house. There was almost no running water, one water spigot for thousands of men. The prisoners stood in line for hours in the blazing sun, waiting for a chance to fill a canteen. Many collapsed and died while waiting. Food was minimal, a small ball of rice, sometimes a bit of vegetable matter, sometimes nothing. The men were already starving when they arrived. Now they starved further. The sanitation facilities consisted of open-slit trenches along the sides of the camp. In the tropical heat, with thousands of men suffering from dysentery, these trenches became cesspools of disease. Flies swarmed from them in black clouds, covering the prisoners' food, their mouths, their eyes. Malaria swept through the camp. Dysentery was universal. Beriberi twisted men's bodies. Tropical ulcers ate away at flesh, exposing bone. Men became living skeletons. Their teeth loosened and fell out from scurvy. Their skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls. They began to die at a rate of 400 per day. Every morning, burial details carried out dozens of corpses. Some were friends. Some were strangers. All were Americans and Filipinos who had fought bravely and surrendered honorably, only to be worked and starved to death by their captors. The dead were buried in mass graves. There were too many to bury individually, too many to even count accurately. The burial details used improvised litters, doors torn from buildings, pieces of canvas, sometimes just dragging the bodies by their arms. Medical care was non-existent. The camp had a so-called hospital, but it existed only to segregate the very ill from the less ill. There were no medicines, no bandages, no instruments. Doctors could do nothing but watch their patients die. American military doctors worked alongside Filipino doctors, both groups equally helpless. They held men's hands as they died. They whispered comfort to those in pain, but they could not heal. They could not save. John Stensby, captured in May, joined the survivors at O'Donnell. The camp was in its full horror by then. Bodies everywhere. Men dying every hour. The living looking like the walking dead. But Stensby had a will to survive that would carry him through the years ahead. He looked at the horrors around him and made a decision. He would not die here. He would outlast his captors. He would survive to tell the story. By July 1942, the death rate at Camp O'Donnell had become so catastrophic that even the Japanese recognized the camp was failing. They closed it. The 1547 Americans who had perished there were buried in the camp cemetery. They would remain there until after the war, when American graves registration personnel would disinter them and attempt to identify the remains. The American prisoners were transferred to other camps. Stensby passed through Balabid Prison in Manila, a colonial-era facility that the Japanese had converted to a POW camp in Transit Point. Balabid was marginally better than O'Donnell. The prisoners had access to water. They could even shower. For men who had not bathed in months, this felt like luxury. From Balabid, the men marched 3 miles to a railhead. Again, they were stuffed into steel-sided boxcars, 100 men per car. Again, the heat was unbearable. Again, some died in transit. 10 miles from the second railhead, approximately 95 kilometers north of Manila, sat Camp Cabanatuan. This would become the largest and most permanent POW camp in the Philippines, eventually housing as many as 10,000 American prisoners. Cabanatuan had been a Philippine Army training facility. It consisted of 3 camps. Camp 1 sat 9 kilometers east of the city of Cabanatuan. Camp 2 was 6 kilometers further east, but it closed quickly due to lack of water. Camp 3 operated from May to October 1942, before its prisoners were also transferred to Camp 1. Stensby arrived at Cabanatuan to find a camp divided into a regular area and a hospital area. The hospital, however, was a hospital in name only. As one in-prison doctor noted, it served only to segregate the very ill from the less ill. There was no real medical care. The conditions at Cabanatuan were marginally better than at O'Donnell, but only marginally. Men still died by the dozens every day. Disease was rampant, food was inadequate. The prisoners were forced to work on various labor details, building roads, clearing jungle, moving supplies. The prisoners at Cabanatuan established a cemetery for their dead. At first, the burials were haphazard, but eventually the camp chaplains instituted order. Each grave was marked. Records were kept. The chaplains held brief ceremonies when the Japanese guards permitted it. By August 1942, the Japanese even allowed grave markers to be erected. The cemetery grew steadily. By the end of the war, 2,764 Americans and Filipinos would be buried there. Despite the careful record-keeping, 1,007 of the dead would remain unidentified when American Graves registration personnel finally exhumed the graves in the late 1940s. The tropical climate, the conditions of burial, and the advanced state of starvation that most bodies were in at death made identification extremely difficult. John Stensby witnessed death daily at Cabanatuan. Men he had served with, men he had fought beside, men he had shared rations with. They died one by one. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, starvation, disease, despair. Some men simply gave up. They stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped trying. Within days, they were dead. The prisoners called it giving up the ghost. But Stensby did not give up. He worked when ordered, he ate whatever was provided, no matter how disgusting. He forced himself to stay alive 1 day at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 minute at a time. The prisoners developed elaborate strategies for survival. They created detailed maps of the camp. They kept hidden diaries, recording names and dates. They established networks for sharing food and information. They sabotaged Japanese equipment when possible, subtle acts of defiance that could not be traced. They maintained military discipline and structure, even though they were prisoners. This helped preserve morale and order. Some prisoners formed tight-knit groups, supporting each other through the worst times. Others became loners, trusting no one. Some collaborated with the Japanese, earning extra rations by informing on their fellow prisoners. These collaborators were despised but tolerated because no one had the strength for violence. Stensby formed friendships with other prisoners, men whose names he would remember for the rest of his life. Men who would die before liberation. Men whose loss would haunt him forever. Buddy after buddy dropped by the wayside, he later recalled. In the camps, on the ships, in the factories, in the mines. By 1944, the Japanese began moving large numbers of prisoners from the Philippines to Japan and other occupied territories. The reason was simple: slave labor. Japan's industries were desperate for workers. Male Japanese workers had been conscripted into the military. The factories, mines, docks, and construction sites needed laborers. The prisoners of war would fill this need. The transport of prisoners from the Philippines to Japan ranks among the worst atrocities of the war. The ships used for transport, known as hell ships to the prisoners, were unmarked cargo vessels. They flew no Red Cross flags. They bore no indication that they carried prisoners of war. To Allied submarines and aircraft, they looked like legitimate military targets. and they were attacked accordingly. Stensby was selected for transport to Taiwan in 1944. He was crammed aboard a hell ship with hundreds of other prisoners. The conditions defied description. The prisoners were packed into the cargo holds, sometimes 1,000 men or more in a space designed for cargo. They could not sit down. They could not lie down. They stood pressed together, body to body, in total darkness. The holds were closed and battened down, sealed against the light and air. The heat was unimaginable. In the tropical climate, with no ventilation, the temperature in the holds climbed to 120 degrees or higher. Men passed out. Men died. Their bodies remained standing, held upright by the press of living bodies around them. There was no food. Sometimes a bucket of rice was lowered into the hold, and the prisoners fought over it like animals. There was almost no water. Men went mad with thirst. Some drank their own urine. Some drank the urine of others. Some died of dehydration while standing in the suffocating darkness. The toilet facilities consisted of a single bucket. With hundreds of men, almost all suffering from dysentery, the bucket overflowed immediately. Men were forced to relieve themselves where they stood. Feces and urine covered the floor of the hold, sloshing with the motion of the ship. The stench was beyond description. Men vomited and added their vomit to the horror. Some ships were attacked by American submarines or aircraft. The prisoners heard the explosions, felt the impacts. They screamed for help, but no one could hear them from inside the sealed holds. Some ships sank. Those in the holds drowned like rats in a trap. The Japanese guards often machine-gunned prisoners who tried to escape from sinking ships. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, died. One hell ship, the Lisbon Maru, was torpedoed by the USS Grouper on September 27, 1942. The Japanese sealed the hatches, trapping the prisoners inside as the ship sank. When desperate prisoners finally broke out, the guards machine-gunned them. Approximately 1,000 Allied POWs died. Another hell ship, the Shinyo Maru, was torpedoed by an American submarine on September 7, 1944. Of 750 POWs aboard, only 83 survived. The guards shot prisoners trying to escape the sinking vessel. Stensby's transport to Taiwan was successful, meaning the ship was not sunk. But the journey was hell nonetheless. Days in the darkness, days without food or water, days standing in filth, days wondering if an American torpedo would end his life, days of men dying around him and being unable to move away from their corpses. When the ship finally reached Taiwan, Stensby stumbled out into the light, barely alive. His eyes could not adjust to the brightness. His legs could barely support him. He had lost even more weight. He was covered in filth and disease, but he was alive. In Taiwan, Stensby was put to work on road construction. The labor was brutal. The prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in tropical heat with minimal food and water. They hauled stones, broke rocks, dug ditches, built roads that would support Japanese military transport. The guards beat the prisoners regularly. Any perceived slowness earned a beating with bamboo sticks or rifle butts. Any sign of weakness earned a beating. Any glance at a guard earned a beating. The prisoners learned to work mechanically, eyes down, moving steadily, never stopping, never complaining, never drawing attention. Men died during the road work. Heart attacks from exertion, heat stroke, exhaustion. Some were beaten to death. Some simply collapsed and did not rise. The guards left the bodies by the roadside and kept the remaining prisoners working. Stensby developed the ability to appear to be working hard while actually doing as little as possible. He moved constantly, but accomplished minimal work. He picked up the same rock multiple times. He walked back and forth without purpose. He learned to look busy without being productive. It was a survival skill and a form of sabotage. After his time in Taiwan, Stensby was transferred again. Another hell ship. Another hellish voyage across the sea. This time, the destination was Japan itself, the heart of the enemy empire. the place where the worst was yet to come. Arriving in Japan via the port of Moji in January 1945, Stensby was first sent to the Yokohama docks. Japan's cities were under increasing air attack by this point in the war. American bombers struck regularly. The docks were a prime target. At Yokohama, Stensby worked as a stevedore, unloading ships, hauling cargo, moving war materials. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The prisoners lifted heavy loads with no equipment, using only their emaciated bodies. Many suffered hernias, back injuries, crushed limbs when cargo shifted or fell. The guards drove the prisoners relentlessly. The Japanese war effort was desperate now. Every ship had to be unloaded quickly. Every piece of cargo was critical. The prisoners worked in all weather, blazing sun, driving rain, bitter cold. They had inadequate clothing. Their shoes fell apart. Many worked barefoot, their feet bleeding and infected. Food remained minimal. A small bowl of rice, perhaps some fish, perhaps some watery soup. Never enough. The prisoners grew weaker by the day. Their bodies consumed their own muscle. Their organs began to fail. Yet they were forced to continue working, continue lifting, continue moving, until they literally could not continue. Then they died. At the Yokohama docks, Stensby employed his sabotage skills again. He was ordered to do welding work on a Japanese warship. Stensby deliberately botched the job. His incompetent welds created a launch that became an extreme embarrassment for the Japanese Navy. The defective work was discovered after the vessel was launched. The Japanese never connected the sabotage to Stensby specifically, but he knew. It was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance, but it mattered to him. This deliberate incompetence was common among POW laborers. They worked slowly. They broke tools accidentally. They misunderstood instructions. They created defective products. It was the only form of resistance available to them, and they pursued it whenever possible. Every broken machine, every ruined product, every delayed project was a small blow against their captors. American aircraft began bombing Yokohama with increasing frequency as 1945 progressed. During air raids, the Japanese guards fled to shelters, often leaving the prisoners exposed. The prisoners took cover as best they could, hiding under docks, in trenches, anywhere that might offer protection from the bombs and shrapnel. The bombing killed prisoners, along with Japanese civilians and soldiers. But many prisoners welcomed the raids. Each bomb that fell was a sign that America was winning. Each raid meant the war was closer to ending. The prisoners cheered silently when they heard American engines overhead. They prayed the war would end before they died. In mid-1945, as the war entered its final months, John Stensby was transferred to northern Honshu Island, to the coal mining region around Sendai. This transfer would expose him to the worst conditions of his captivity. The coal mines of Sendai were death traps, and the prisoners who worked them called the place Hell. Sendai was home to multiple POW camps, each associated with coal mines operated by major Japanese corporations. Camp 1B at Yumoto, Camp 2B at Yoshima, Camp 3B at Hosokura, Camp 4B at Osarizawa, Camp 5B at Kamaishi. Each camp housed hundreds of Allied prisoners, mostly British, Dutch, Australian, and American. Each camp supplied slave labor to mines that operated under conditions that would be illegal in any civilized nation. The prisoners arrived at the Sendai camps to witness a scene of utter horror. British prisoner Tom Marsh described it. That evening we saw the other prisoners come out of the pit, returning from the day's work in the mines. There were 200 British and 200 Malayan Dutch prisoners. It was an unbelievable, vivid scene of tortured humanity. Half-naked, emaciated bodies black with coal dust, barefoot and adorned in rags, hardly able to walk with backs bowed. It was like viewing a procession of the living dead. These living skeletons paid no attention to us as they shuffled into camp, dispersing to their huts. The ultimate in human misery, somehow maintaining the power to live. Marsh made a vow. I made a vow then and there that come what may, I would not go down into the mine. I still had the willpower to decide my own fate, and this was the end of the road for me. I had enough. Life as these men now lived would be intolerable. But there was no choice. The prisoners were forced into the mines. Those who refused were beaten. Those who continued to refuse were beaten to death. The mines needed workers, and the prisoners were utterly expendable. John Stensby descended into the Sendai mines in the summer of 1945. The shaft went down over a mile into the earth, over 5,280 feet straight down into darkness. There was no adequate ventilation. The air was thick with coal dust that filled the lungs and blackened everything. There were minimal safety provisions. The pit props, wooden supports meant to prevent cave-ins, were so scarce and so rotted that collapses were frequent and deadly. The prisoners worked in near-total darkness, lit only by small lamps that barely penetrated the gloom. They worked in water, sometimes up to their knees, in cold, filthy water that seeped from the earth. They worked naked or nearly naked because clothing was useless in the heat and wet, and would only become coated with coal dust. The work consisted of mining coal by hand. The prisoners used picks and shovels to hack away at the coal face. Sometimes they used pneumatic jackhammers that weighed 60 pounds, with drill bits 13 feet long. The tools were heavy and dangerous. Men were crushed when equipment fell. Men were injured when tools slipped. Men were buried when tunnels collapsed. American Sergeant B.W. Givens described the mine. "What a mine! I'm sure the laws in the states wouldn't allow such a mine to operate. It looked as if the whole works would come down any minute, but they told us that only one person had been killed during the past year." This was clearly a lie. Many more than one person died in those mines. The prisoners worked 12-hour shifts. Day shift alternated with night shift every 10 days. This meant the prisoners never adjusted to a regular sleep schedule. They worked around the clock in the darkness, losing track of time, losing track of days, existing in a timeless hell underground. The Japanese civilian miners who worked alongside the prisoners were brutal. American POW David Runge recalled that they were like animals, ignorant and stupid, speaking a patois that was hard to understand. They threw coal at the prisoners, beat them, some even bit them. The civilian workers took out their own frustrations and hatred on the helpless prisoners. The Japanese guards and mine foremen were equally cruel. They beat prisoners who worked too slowly. They withheld food from prisoners who failed to meet quotas. They forced sick men to continue working until they collapsed. The mines were supervised by quartermasters, men who had quasi-military authority but no formal rank. These quartermasters controlled the camp's economies and discipline. They decided who ate and who starved. They decided who lived and who died. The tunnels where the POWs worked were often abandoned sections that Japanese mining companies had deemed too dangerous for their own workers. These were stripped mines, where the coal had been largely extracted and the tunnel's underpinnings had been removed. The tunnels were unstable, prone to collapse, filled with rotting timber supports that could give way at any moment. Coal was loaded into coal cars called skips. Winding gear pulled the cars up to hoists that took the coal to the surface. The cables that operated the winding gear swayed back and forth across the narrow, low tunnels. The prisoners had to duck and dodge the cables while pushing loaded coal cars. Many injuries were caused by cables hitting men's heads or limbs. Some men were decapitated by the cables. Others lost arms or hands. Every day in the Sendai mines was Russian roulette. Would today be the day the tunnel collapsed? Would today be the day a cable struck? Would today be the day the foreman decided to make an example of someone? The prisoners lived in constant fear. But they also continued their subtle sabotage. American POW Stanley Kyler told journalist George Weller, "I've been working 22 months for Baron Mitsui. 4 months was driving hard rock, and 18 months was shoveling coal, 12 to 14 hours a day. but Kyler also engaged in sabotage. My attitude was to do everything in my power to cripple that coal mine. I took emery dust down the coal mine and put it in the motors, and chewed up the chain conveyor motors. Australian POW David Runge describes similar sabotage. My particular group was to look for coal, and when we found the coal, we'd drill a long tunnel through the seam of coal, and then the coal extractors would come and take all that seam out. But Runge and others deliberately worked slowly, drilling inaccurately, accidentally breaking equipment. John Stensby engaged in the same tactics. He appeared to work hard, but accomplished minimal output. He sabotaged equipment when possible. He broke tools accidentally. Every small act of defiance was a way to maintain dignity and strike back at his torturers. He could not fight with weapons, but he could fight with incompetence. In the Sendai mines and camps, death was constant. Men died in cave-ins, buried under tons of rock and coal. Their bodies were sometimes recovered, sometimes left entombed forever. Men died of black lung disease, their lungs destroyed by coal dust. They coughed blood and struggled to breathe until they suffocated. Men died of malnutrition, their bodies finally giving out after years of starvation. Men died of disease, tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery. Men died of injuries, crushed limbs, broken backs, severed arteries. Men died of exhaustion, their hearts simply stopping after one shift too many. The death rate among Allied POWs in Japan was catastrophic. Approximately 36,000 Allied prisoners were held in Japan during the war. The mortality rate reached 27%. More than 1 in 4 prisoners died. This compares to a 2% death rate for American POWs held by Nazi Germany. Being a prisoner of the Japanese was more than 13 times deadlier than being a prisoner of the Germans. Stensby watched buddy after buddy die. Men he had trained with, men he had fought beside on baton, men he had survived the death march with, men he had endured the hell ships with. They died one by one, and there was nothing he could do to save them. He could only witness, remember, and vow to survive to tell their stories. Some prisoners simply gave up. After years of brutality, starvation, and hopelessness, they lost the will to live. They stopped eating, stopped working, stopped caring. Within days, they were dead. The human body can only endure so much. The human spirit can only endure so much. For some, the breaking point came in the mines. For others, it had come years earlier, and they had been dying slowly ever since. But John Stensby refused to break. He had something inside him. Call it stubbornness, call it spite, call it a survival instinct honed to razor sharpness that would not allow him to give up. He told himself, "I will outlive these bastards. I will survive this. I will make it home." And he repeated this to himself like a mantra, day after day, shift after shift, hour after hour. Stensby's survival was partly luck. He avoided the worst cave-ins. He avoided the worst diseases. He avoided the worst beatings. He had moments of good fortune that others lacked. But survival was also will. He forced himself to eat, no matter how disgusting the food. He forced himself to work, no matter how exhausted. He forced himself to endure, no matter how much he wanted to give up. And finally, mercifully, terrifyingly, the end came. August 6, 1945, 08:15. The world changes forever. An American B-29 bomber drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 people die instantly. The city is obliterated. August 9th, 1945, 11:02. A second atomic bomb falls on Nagasaki. 40,000 die instantly. Japan's will to continue the war is shattered. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles over Japanese radios, announcing surrender. For the first time, the Japanese people hear their God Emperor's voice. He tells them the war is over. He tells them they must bear the unbearable. The empire has fallen. In the Sendai coal mines, the prisoners hear rumors. Then they hear confirmation. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. They are free. But they are not yet safe. On July 16, 1945, a month before surrender, American aircraft bombed Sendai POW Camp 5B at Kamaishi and its associated Nippon Steel iron mill. At least 42 POWs were killed by American bombs. The prisoners knew the danger. Their camps were unmarked, located near legitimate military and industrial targets. Allied forces had no way to know prisoners were there. The prisoners could be killed by their own country's weapons. Some prisoners reported that Japanese guards told them explicitly, if Allied forces invaded Japan, all prisoners would be executed first. The guards showed them trenches and tunnels where the executions would occur. The Palawan Massacre on December 14, 1944, proved this was not an empty threat. On that date, Japanese soldiers herded 150 American POWs into trenches, poured gasoline over them, and burned them alive. Only 11 escaped. The rest died screaming, burning, trying desperately to climb out while machine guns cut them down. The prisoners at Sendai knew they were alive only by luck and by Japan's sudden surrender. Had the war continued weeks longer, had the invasion of Japan proceeded, they would have been executed. Every prisoner understood how close they had come to death, even after surviving years of captivity. On August 20, 1945, 5 days after the surrender announcement, American aircraft began dropping supplies to POW camps across Japan. Food, medicine, clothing, radios, cigarettes. The prisoners watched as parachutes drifted down, carrying barrels painted with American flags and marked POW supplies. Some prisoners wept, some cheered, some stood in silence, unable to process that their ordeal was finally over. Liberation teams arrived in September 1945. American and Allied forces entered the camps to document conditions and evacuate the prisoners. Doctors and photographers recorded the evidence. The prisoners weighed an average of 90 pounds. Many weighed less than 80 pounds. They were skeletal, diseased, traumatized. They had survived, but they were forever changed. Journalist George Weller reached Fukuoka POW Camp 17 at the Mitsui coal mines on September 10, 1945. He was the first non-Japanese outsider to see the camp. He interviewed survivors and documented their accounts. His reports helped establish the historical record of what the prisoners endured. John Stensby was liberated in September 1945. He returned to the United States later that year. He was discharged from service on June 24, 1946, with the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 3. He had survived 3.5 years of captivity. He had survived conditions designed to kill him. He had survived the Bataan Siege, the Death March aftermath, Balabid, Cabanatuan, the Hell Ships, Taiwan Labor, Yokohama Docks, and the Sendai coal mines. He had survived buddy after buddy dropping by the wayside. He had survived when tens of thousands did not. The statistics are staggering. Of the approximately 140,000 American and Filipino soldiers who surrendered or were captured in the Philippines in 1942, roughly 40,000 died in captivity. That is a death rate approaching 30%. These were not combat deaths. These were deaths from starvation, disease, brutality, and deliberate cruelty. Of American POWs specifically held by Japan, the mortality rate was 27%, nearly 40% when including all Allied POWs. Compare this to German POW camps, where American POWs experienced a 2% mortality rate. Being captured by Japan was a death sentence for more than 1 in 4 prisoners. The Bataan Death March killed approximately 10,000 men. Camp O'Donnell killed 1,547 Americans and approximately 26,000 Filipinos in just a few months. Cabanatuan and other Philippine camps killed thousands more. The Hell ships killed thousands more. Exact numbers are unknown because the ships were unmarked and sank without records. The work camps in Japan and occupied territories killed thousands more. The coal mines of Sendai alone held 11 separate POW camps, each with hundreds of prisoners working for corporations that still exist today. Mitsubishi Materials, Nippon Steel, JX Nippon Mining and Metals, Furukawa Company, now Dowa Holdings, Joban Kyoto Power Company. These corporations used slave labor, worked men to death, and profited from their suffering. After the war, some Japanese officers were tried for war crimes. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, commander of Japanese forces during the invasion of the Philippines, and the officer responsible for the Bataan Death March, was convicted and executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946. But most of those responsible were never punished. Most guards escaped justice. Most civilian supervisors who beat prisoners faced no consequences. Most corporations that profited from slave labor faced no reckoning. The POW survivors returned home traumatized, broken in body and spirit. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder before the condition had a name. They had nightmares of the camps, the mines, the guards, the deaths. They struggled with survivor's guilt, asking themselves why they lived when so many died. They struggled with physical ailments, damaged lungs from coal dust, weakened hearts from starvation, chronic dysentery, malaria that returned in cycles for years. Many survivors did not speak about their experiences for decades. The trauma was too great. The memories were too painful. They buried their past and tried to live normal lives. But the ghosts remained. The faces of dead buddies haunted them. The sounds of beatings echoed in their ears. The hunger never fully left them. Many survivors hoarded food for the rest of their lives, unable to shake the fear that starvation was always one day away. John Stensby eventually told his story. He gave an oral history to the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. His recorded testimony, along with documents, photographs, and artifacts from his service, is preserved in the Library of Congress collection. His story is part of the historical record now, ensuring that future generations will know what he and thousands like him endured. Stensby described his experiences with remarkable clarity and detail. He spoke of the battles on Bataan and Corregidor. He spoke of Japanese mistreatment of prisoners. He spoke of the single-handed sabotage jobs that gave him small victories. He spoke of sabotaging the Japanese war effort in whatever ways he could. He spoke of narrowly escaping death. Whether by luck or instinct, he was never sure. He even spoke of a premature report of his death sent to his family, causing them anguish before they learned he was alive. In his recorded testimony, Stensby maintained a matter-of-fact tone. He did not dramatize. He did not exaggerate. He simply told what happened, in the plain language of a soldier reporting facts. But beneath that calm surface, the horror was evident. The things he described were beyond imagination, yet they were real. They happened. He survived them. In September 2010, the Japanese government delivered an official, cabinet-approved apology to American POWs for the damage and suffering they endured. Although Japan had hosted POWs from other wartime allies since the late 1990s, this was the first trip to Japan for American POWs, and the first official apology to any prisoners of war held by Japan. The apology was not accompanied by compensation. Japan has consistently maintained that all war reparations issues were settled by the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. But for survivors like Lester Tenney, who mined coal for Mitsui at the Omuta mines, the apology was important. Tenney was instrumental in persuading the Japanese government to offer the apology and initiate trips of reconciliation. In following years, small groups of surviving POWs traveled to Japan as guests of the Japanese government. They revisited the sites where they had been held. They stood at the gates of former camps. They walked past mines where they had labored. They met with Japanese officials. They participated in ceremonies of remembrance. The survivors were in their late 80s and 90s by then. They were the last living witnesses to these events. They carried with them the weight of history and the memories of the dead. They represented not only themselves, but the thousands who did not survive to see justice, even this limited justice. What is remarkable is how little bitterness many survivors displayed. Harold Nichols, who spent time in an open-pit iron mine in northern Japan, said, "I get a kick out of seeing how well this nation is doing." Alfonso Sanchez, who worked at the Omuda coal mine and later as a stevedore in Tokyo, said, "I went through all that suffering, and the Japanese went through all those bombings. I take a bit of pride in all of this. What they have done is unbelievable." This lack of hatred, this ability to forgive, speaks to the character of these men. They suffered unspeakable brutality, but did not become consumed by vengeance. They acknowledged the past, but chose to embrace the present and future. They accepted Japan's apology, however belated, and moved forward with their lives. But other survivors were less forgiving. They could not forget the beatings, the starvation, the deaths of their comrades. They could not accept that the corporations that profited from their labor never paid reparations. They could not forgive guards who beat them and were never punished. For these survivors, the wounds never healed. Both responses are understandable. Both are valid. The men who suffered have the right to react however they choose. John L. Stensby Sr. passed away years after recording his oral history. He lived to old age, carrying his memories and his scars until the end. He had survived when 2/3 of his fellow American POWs of Japan did not. He had seen the worst of humanity and somehow maintained his own humanity. He had endured torture, starvation, slavery, and the constant presence of death. Yet he survived. Today, memorials exist to commemorate the prisoners. The site of Camp O'Donnell has a memorial. The site of Cabanatuan has a memorial. The route of the Bataan Death March is marked with white concrete markers at intervals along the roadway. In the Philippines, April 9th is observed as a national holiday, the Day of Valor, commemorating the fall of Bataan and the beginning of the Death March. In Japan, some former POW camps have memorials, others have nothing. Some mines had been turned into tourist attractions, with museums celebrating the history of mining but making no mention of Allied POW slave labor. The Osarizawa mine is now Mineland Osarizawa, with an amusement section called Cosmo Adventure, focused on space-themed indoor games. Visitors walk through the old tunnels, not knowing that prisoners once labored and died there. The Hosokura mine is now Hosokura Mine Park, where visitors can walk through the main tunnel. Again, no mention of the prisoners. This selective memory is troubling. History should not be sanitized. The suffering should not be erased. The dead deserve to be remembered, not forgotten, for the sake of tourism and corporate image. The former POWs who participated in Japan's reconciliation trips were often frustrated by this. They visited sites where they had suffered and found no acknowledgement of what happened there. They stood at factories where they had worked as slaves and saw no plaques, no monuments, no recognition. The corporations that profited from their labor, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Nippon Steel, Furukawa, and others, never formally apologized and never paid compensation. In 2015, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe included in his war anniversary statement recognition of the former POWs who experienced unbearable sufferings caused by the Japanese military. This was significant. But for many survivors, words were not enough. They wanted justice. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted the world to remember. The Japanese government has been especially alarmed by criticism of how it treats sites on the UNESCO World Industrial Heritage List. The Meiji Industrial Revolution sites, iron and steel works, shipbuilding, and coal mining facilities have UNESCO World Heritage status. But there is no mention of POW slave labor at these sites. Critics argue this is historical revisionism, erasing inconvenient truths to present a sanitized version of the past. The surviving POWs and their families continue to advocate for full recognition. They urge members of Congress to talk to their Japanese counterparts, to Japanese companies, and to the U.S. State Department to respect and honor the memory of the former American POWs of Japan. They urge people not to let Japan revise its apology. They urge people to remember. Because if we do not remember, if we allow the history to be forgotten or sanitized, then the dead died for nothing. Their suffering becomes meaningless, and the survivor's testimony becomes worthless. John Stensby's story matters because it is true. Every detail is documented. Every event is verified. His testimony is preserved in the Library of Congress. His experiences are corroborated by thousands of other survivors. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. This happened. This is real. And it must never be forgotten. The ghosts of Batan, of Cabanatuan, of the hell ships, of the Sendai mines, they demand remembrance. The 40,000 American and Filipino prisoners who died in Japanese captivity, they demand justice. The survivors who carried the burden of memory until their dying day, they demand that we never forget. John Stensby did his part. He survived. He testified. He told the truth. Now it is our duty to listen, to remember, and to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. All dates, names, places, statistics, and events described in this story are documented in these sources. No fictional elements have been added. The dialogue attributed to real persons comes from their recorded testimony or published memoirs. This is a work of documentary horror. Horror that comes not from imagination, but from historical fact.